Hi, welcome to my presentation where I look at the impact of different wave effects, namely wave breaking, Langmuir turbulence, and conservative Stokes drift effects on operation dynamics during hurricanes. So just a quick outline, I'm going to go through a short introduction, then the setup of the coupled wave circulation model, subsection of the results, and finally the conclusions. So the main objective of my research was to quantify several different wave effects, namely Langmuir turbulence, wave breaking, and the conservative Stokes drift impact on operation dynamics during idealized hurricane conditions. And to do this, I used the coupled wave circulation model Quest, where the circulation model component is ROMS and the wave model component is SWAN. The main background is that waves are important to ocean mixing. This is what I'm looking to explore. So for my idealized study, I used a simple rectangular domain and examined constant translation speeds for the hurricanes where they're moving westward. Three different speeds that I selected are 2.5, 5, and 10 meters per second, where my domain is in 12th degree resolution, and I'm using 64 different vertical levels and a flat, uniform 5,000 meter bathymetry. My initial conditions were that there was no background currents and there was no background swell or any other wave effects. I'm starting from rest. And the initial temperature is horizontally uniform, as is the salinity, but I prescribed a vertical profile of both from a September climatology. The wind velocity is also prescribed. Now that I did from the Holland et al. 2010 wind model, where I looked at a Category 3 or selected a Category 3 hurricane with a maximum wind speed of 50 meters per second and a radius maximum wind of 55 kilometers. Now this magenta circle here just shows the radius maximum wind. The vectors are the wind speed, and the green is just to show the magnitude of the wind speed. The dashed magenta line is the storm track. So I ran these simulations for 72 hours for all three cases, again, to look at the different wave effects. And while people might be able to understand, at least visually, what wave breaking is, not everyone might necessarily be familiar with Langmuir turbulence. I know this says Langmuir circulation, I'm going to explain the difference. So Langmuir circulation refers to counter-rotating vortices that form the upper ocean mix layer due to the interaction between the Stokes drift and the current vorticity, or the curl of the currents. What this does is it produces regions of surface current convergence and downwelling, but also regions in which the surface currents diverge, and that's where you get the return flow or upwelling. Now, in this very simple diagram that looks very pretty, the counter-rotating vortices, or Langmuir cells, are perfectly symmetrical. But in reality, they're actually highly variable, both spatially and temporally. And that's why it's referred to as Langmuir turbulence as opposed to just Langmuir circulation. So the circulation model I'm using, ROMS, is governed by the Reynolds average Navier-Stokes equation, which looks like this before you include any wave effects. If anybody wants me to explain what all the terms are, I'd be happy to later, but the main focus of my study is wave effects. So one of the conservative terms is the Coriolis-Stokes forcing. It's the interaction between the Stokes drift and the inertial frequency, F. And there's also the contribution from wave breaking. So what's currently enabled within Quest is for a wave breaking induced acceleration, or a wave breaking induced current. Future studies, I'd like to actually replace this with a different way of parameterizing the wave breaking contributions to the circulation, where instead of saying what the model currently does, which is the stress into the currents, this tau c term, is simply equal to the surface wind stress, we'd also be accounting for the waves. So the stress from the wind to the waves, then also the stress induced by the wave breaking. Now there's a separate second contribution from wave breaking to the model. So the vertical mixing tends to occur on a very fine spatial scale, and at a small temporal scale as well. And that can't be resolved directly in the model because it just doesn't, we don't have the computational resources for that. So that gets parameterized. And there, the wave breaking to the turbulent mixing, or turbulent vertical mixing, it's contributing there as a surface flux of TKA. But again, there are two different terms. That's specifically the vertical mixing, and then there's the separate part on the horizontal circulation. And finally, since the Langmuir turbulence tends to occur on spatial scales with dominant lengths of 10 to 100 meters, that can't be resolved in models such as mine that are 12th degree resolution. So it has to get parameterized within the Reynolds stress. So there's the initial term, the vertical shear of the currents, and then the Langmuir turbulence parameterization, which is the vertical shear of the Stokes drift. Now what the vertical turbulence closure scale does, or the way in which the turbulent mixing is parameterized, is that uses a separate model, and that ends up calculating this eddy viscosity term. Okay, so I used 6 different experiments for my study. There's the fully coupled experiment, or the two-way fully coupled experiment, where I included all the wave effects that I mentioned, wave breaking, the Langmuir turbulence, and then the 3 different conservative Stokes drift impacts. There's the resolved scale vortex force, the Coriolis-Stokes forcing, and also the advection of the tracers due to the Stokes drift. So there's a separate tracer equation that I didn't show and didn't go delve into, and that's just due, again, to time constraints and the fact that that's not the primary focus of what I'm doing. Now, all of the above are wave effects on currents, but wave-current interactions also include current effects on waves. So I included that in the study for completeness, but I didn't change anything within the model. It's already built in. One thing that I did change, though, is the way the Stokes drift is getting calculated. I used a spectral method. So what that does is that calculates the Stokes drift velocity from the full 2D wave energy spectrum, as opposed to the default, which uses simple bulk parameterization, such as significant wave height, the mean wavelength, and the mean wave direction. So that's, again, the two-way fully coupled, or the entire fully coupled experiment. There's also the one-way fully coupled experiment, where included all of the wave effects except no current effects on waves. There's the baseline experiment, which is the circulation-only case, and there's no wave effects in that one. And then the final 3 are ones where I selectively disabled wave effects. So one where I just disabled the Langmuir turbulence, another where I disabled the wave breaking, and the third where I disabled the conservative Stokes drift effects. And what's interesting about the 3 different translation speeds is the fact that they produce very significantly different wave fields. So the wave height, or significant wave height, is defined as the highest 1/3 of waves in a wave field. That's due to observational bias, or more mathematically as 4 times the square root of the wave energy, which is just the integrated wave energy density spectrum over all frequencies and directions. So what's interesting here is, as the translation speed increases, so it's the slow case, 2.5 meters per second, where the storm is moving westward. The middle case, where it's moving westward at 5 meters per second, and then on the right, where it's moving westward at 10 meters per second, you'll notice the waves get bigger, and so too does the asymmetric distribution of the wave height. And this is because the higher waves are under the wind for a longer period of time, because what happens here is the faster moving hurricane more closely matches the speed with which the waves are traveling, or the wave energy is traveling. That's known as the group velocity of the waves. So it produces a resonance that's known as the extended fetch, or the trapped fetch effect. So what I do next is I look here at the surface currents, where the black vectors are the surface currents in the base experiment. So that's, again, the circulation only case. And in the top 3 panels, the red vectors are the surface currents from the fully coupled experiment. In the bottom row, again, the black vectors are surface currents from the base experiment, but this time the red vectors are the surface currents from the no wave breaking experiment. So then you may wonder, why did I select these 2 and not show all of the other 5, or all of the 5 coupled experiments? Well, I selected the fully coupled case because that showed the greatest differences between any of the coupled simulations in the base experiment, and I chose the no wave breaking simulations that showed the smallest differences. So what this demonstrates is specifically how much the wave breaking contributes. where we see in the fully coupled case, the currents are reduced and also deflected to the right relative to the base. So you have a similar effect, but just to a much smaller degree in the bottom three panels in the no wave breaking experiment. Also, the wave effects change the sea surface temperature distribution. So here, the top three panels show the differences in the surface temperature between the fully coupled experiment and the base, and the bottom three panels for the no wave breaking experiment and the base experiment. And here, again, this dashed black line shows the storm track, the green dot, the storm center location after 72-hour simulation, and the black circle, the radius of maximum wind. Now, there's a big difference between these two cases. What we see is in the fully coupled, a pretty significant surface cooling in the coupled simulation relative to base. And there is a bit of surface cooling, but to a much lesser degree in no wave breaking relative to base, but it's still present. What this is important is that hurricanes' intensity largely is due to latent heat flux, and this is driven largely by the surface temperature. So if we're underestimating the cooling, we're potentially misrepresenting the latent heat flux. But I also wanted to look at vertical transects of the differences between the currents in the same coupled experiments and the base experiment, and also the differences in the temperature. So the x transects are just the vertical transects along the storm track, and the y transects perpendicular to it right through the center after 72 hours. And the blue is showing a reduction in the currents, and the red an enhancement. So if it's bluer at and near the surface, and red further down the water column here along both the x and y directions, what this is demonstrating is that there's enhanced vertical mixing. So it's bringing the fast-moving currents down the water column, while also bringing the slower-moving currents up, thus reducing the shear of the currents in the vertical direction. Now, there's also big changes to the temperatures. Again, the same vertical transects along the x and the y direction, where the blue is showing the increased cooling due to the wave effects, and the red are warm temperature anomalies. So it's not just this simple uniform cooling everywhere. So the main takeaways here are that wave breaking of the individual wave effects that I examined had the biggest impact, which was a little surprising. I was expecting it to be Langmuir turbulence. But the combined wave effects had the biggest differences relative to circulation only. because they can reduce the surface currents, enhance the cold wake, and the cooling as well as warm anomalies are not confined to the surface. So in the future, I'd like to account for the wave-breaking contributions to the circulation differently, and I also want to examine a real hurricane case. After my initial study here, where we're about to submit a manuscript, I'd like to thank everybody, and I also have the work cited.